Okay, so this is going to be my last main video, I would think, for this build. And I've got some additional stuff to do around the compass, which I've been having a little bit of problem with. But I think the main question is, got a tune, got auto tune, the thing flies, but how do you get a good tune? How do you get a tune that actually allows the copter to reach its full potential? And this is obviously there's some science here, there's a bit of craft and guesswork as well, and I've ended up with this tune, and I'm pretty happy with it. And I've had a couple of friends fly this tune as well on identical copters, and they're pretty happy with it as well. So I would say this probably does count as a good tune. Is it the best tune you can get with this copter? Well, probably not, but I think it's, you know, it's probably close to what can be achieved without sort of software changes. So how did I get here? And that's what I'm going to try and demonstrate in this video. So tuning is obviously all about the PIDs and these what these values are, and auto-tune produces values for these PIDs, but chooses correct values for the PIDs based on the response for the aircraft. But so you'd think, well, that's the end of it, right? You auto-tune, you get the PIDs, and job done. But there is an interplay between the PIDs and the filtering that goes on, and in particular the filtering of the D term, which you can see here, which is filter D, and the gyro filter, which is, I don't think it's shown here, but it's INS gyro filter, and also the notch filtering as well. So there, obviously there's a harmonic notch filter tracking the tracking the motor noise. So the gyro filter is a low pass filter, so it's filtering out high frequency noise, letting low frequency noise through. And the reason for that is that what you're trying to do is filter out noise and let through information that's about control. So pilot control, the flight controller trying to control the aircraft and respond to the PIDs, or respond to the control implied by the PIDs. And so and there's also, so the higher you set the filter, the more noise you let through, but the lower the latency. So basically filters have this property based on frequency, where the response through the filter is a function of the frequency, which you can kind of sort of imagine that's how filters work to some degree. So it means that if you've got a filter filtering out, it's set at a quite high frequency, then the response to a disturbance through that filter is quite rapid, whereas if you set the filter down to a low frequency, the response to disturbance is quite slow. Now, that may be what you want. It depends on the copter, it depends on the conditions, but that's sort of the basic principle of it. And that the gyro filter is filtering out noise from the gyros in the IMU. And then you also have this D term filter, which is filtering out noise in the D term. And the reason that you might want to do this is that this is the derivative term. So the p-value is proportional to both input and disturbance, and so if you're letting more noise through, the p-value might go up proportionally. But the d term is the derivative of the input, and which means that for any sort of input or disturbance, the d term is likely to react sort of to a greater degree, and so you might want extra filtering on the d term to cut that out, and that's why there's a d term filter as well. And autotune doesn't touch these values, doesn't touch any of the filter settings. All it does is produce a good tune based on the filter settings in the aircraft that you have. And so in order to get a really great tune, you have to modify the filter settings as well as auto-tuning against those filter settings. And so that's exactly what I did. So I started off, if you remember, with some fairly standard settings for the filter of I think it was 80, I think it was 80-50, it probably should have been 80-40, so 80 hertz on the gyro filter, 40 hertz on the D-term filter. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to find that optimum point where you're getting good control, but you're not letting too much noise through. So now there's some other considerations as well, because high frequency noise or perturbation can also put sort of more strain on your motors, on your ESCs. There's lots of different things that you might be tuning for, but in general it's this trade-off between noise and latency. So if you want more noise, you push filters up. If you want, and that gives you higher latency. Sorry, if you want higher latency, you push the filters up, but that gives you higher noise. If you have got too much noise, you push the filters down, but that also gives you higher latency. You get what I mean? Okay. And obviously you have to run a series of experiments. You have to basically auto-tune for different filter settings and see what happens, and that's what I did. And I think so some good things to try are increasing the gyro filter and the D-term filter and decreasing these in stepwise fashion, doing an auto-tune and seeing what the results are. And what you're looking for in the good tune is you want these high values of P. You don't need to worry so much about, but certainly for roll and pitch, a high value of the maximum value is 18, and if it's set to 18, then that means it was able to get a very good tune for those settings. And in fact, all of the tunes I did, I think, had auto-tune set to the 6LP to 18. But then you want to look at what p-value was obtained using the tune, and basically the higher the better, right? So basically the higher the p-value, the tighter the tune auto-tuning was able to obtain without sort of introducing a loss of control. So that's one thing you're looking at. The other thing you're looking at is the noise that's introduced, and particularly the noise on the rate information. So what I've got is I've got a couple of different logs here, so which are sufficiently different that you can kind of see what's going on. So if I show you the first log, and this is this one. No, it's not. This one. Okay. So you can see in this log that I just took off and hovered for a while and then set it down again. Great. So the thing about this log is, so this was with the filter settings at 60/30, I believe. So gyro filter at 60 and D-term filter at 30 Hertz. And so what I'm looking at is, first of all, these RATE, POut, your out values. And essentially looking at what is the sort of noise coming through into the control loops. And if you remember, 0.1 is the maximum we want here. 0.1 is kind of bad. 0.05 is ideal. And you can see here in a hover, there's very, very little noise here at all, which is great. So this looks fantastic. Okay, so low noise, but low filters. And so that's why there is low noise. So let's actually look at the control that was achieved. So instead, let's have a look at pitch, target versus actual. So you see this is PID P here. And you can see here that this is sort of a bit all over the place. So actual is jumping around, target is jumping around, the two are not matching. I mean, overall, they're kind of matching. So you can see when we had some, did a couple of sort of blips here, and there was some tracking, but you can see the error is quite large. Well, it's a couple of degrees, I suppose, but it's larger than you might like, and see the error here is sort of quite large. So this is what we wanted, and this is what we got. And you can see that while target is sort of changing more slowly, the actual is slightly all over the shop relative to this. So control looks not great here, although noise looks fantastic. So that's kind of what we'd expect. And you can see another bit here where you sort of get these differences between what we actually got and what we wanted. And this is just in a hover, so in sort of aggressive echo flight, this is going to be even worse. So this is not a tune that I would want to fly aggressively with. But if you've got a very noisy aircraft, this may be the best that you can do. This is why vibration isolation and notch filtering in particular is so important, because the more noise you remove from the system, the tighter you can make the tune, the better you can get things. And I mean, just remember, so this is 60/30, gyro filters at 60 Hertz, defilter at 30 Hertz. That's still significantly more than you might use for a larger copter, sort of like a, I don't know, 2 kilogram X8 or something, probably even using 40/20 or 20/10, even so much lower settings. And that's because the copter has a lot more mass, it moves more slowly. Having sort of higher latency for the inputs is actually not a bad thing, because the copter simply can't react. But when you've got a copter that's a lot smaller, like this one, where you actually want very sharp response, and it can give you sharp response because of its size and weight and power, then this is not so great. So let's have a look at the other log. So take that one out, pop this one up. So this is at the other end of the spectrum. So this is this is 150 Hertz gyro filter and 75 Hertz D-term filter. Now, until relatively recently, those sorts of numbers were pretty much unheard of with ArduCopter. That's like noise central. That's letting through tons and tons and tons of noise, in theory. But let's see what we sort of got here in terms of the noise that was getting through to the RATE loop. So you can see here that there is a bit more noise than before, but not a lot, So 0.1 is our threshold, and we're down here at 0.01 really for the noise getting through. So that's well within bounds, okay, and quite acceptable. So a bit more noisy, but not that much more noisy, I have to say. So then we have a look at, let's have a look at pitch again, like I did before. So target versus actual. Let's have a look, drill in here, okay. Oh. So you can see here this is a completely different story, okay. So target is red, actual is green, and you can see that the target is, that the actual is tracking the target really closely. So you haven't got all this mess going on. The copter is responding very sharply. You can see there's still a little bit of error here, but compared to the other graph, you can see that it's doing a lot better. And I think if we look at some of these bigger blips here, you can see, I mean, there's still a little bit of error, but it's tracking a lot more closely. So I think this is when I punched the throttle a little bit. You can see that when there was a little bit more going on, there's a little bit of oscillation coming in here. And that's something you have to watch for, right? So in stable hover, there's not much perturbation going on, and the same is true when it's still. When you're flying aggressively, there's a lot of wind, you're pushing more noise into the system, and if the tune is not that great, you're going to start to see oscillation as that noise gets picked up. And that's a little bit what's being seen here. You can see, so the target is fairly smooth here, and you can see the actual is showing a little bit of oscillation around the target. But it's not bad at all. So I'll return to this in a minute. But what I'm going to do, just switch to the FFT. So I've got an FFT of both these logs as well, so you can just see what the FFT looks like in comparison. So switch here. So on the left is the high gyro filter log, and on the right is the low gyro filter log. And there's something really interesting going on here. So you can see that there's actually more noise as we go up into the frequency range. And although we're not using gyro 0 because it's a bit too noisy, you can see that for gyro 0, the low filter scenario is actually a lot worse than the high filter scenario. You can see this sort of, anything above 0 is bad, and you really want it sort of down to the -5, whatever. Not so bad on IMU1, which is a less noisy IMU, but even here you can see when we've got the high filter settings, this drops off very rapidly, which is what you want. We've got a couple of blips which I think are around the harmonics of the RPM notch filters, which is sort of sitting around here. I think it's sort of hovers at 137 hertz or something like that. So that big noise spike has been filtered out, but we're still left with the harmonics from that. But even so, you can see that the noise here is significantly less than the noise for the lower filter settings, which I thought was really interesting. You would expect it would look more noisy, and it actually looks less noisy, which is great. I mean, I was surprised, Leonard was surprised, Trid was surprised, but the thing to say is this is what the notch filter has enabled. So the fact that the notch filter is able to track motor frequency noise so closely means that we can open up some of these other filters and just give a lot more control to the copter. So that's pretty cool. So I'll just go back to my graph here. Not that one. Let's go back to the good graph. We get this one. So so I think, so I was pretty pleased with these results. So I set, and you can see these are the results I'm running with. Filter D is at 75. I know you can't see there. Let me just show you that. Filter D is at 75, and the gyro filter is at 150. So the next question is what to do about these little oscillations here. So what these oscillations show is that the copter is still a little bit overtuned. And so although I got a very, very, very responsive tune by setting those filter settings as I did, since the copter is so kind of noise free, essentially, thanks to the build and the build and the notch filter, what I did was reduced. I did a couple of things. So one was I reduced the aggressiveness of autotune, and you can see here, whoops, in the full parameter list, there's this value autotune agra, and I can't remember what the default is, but I've tuned noisy copters with, I've gone even up to 0.2. That's pushing it a bit, but noisy copters, very small copters, I've tuned with 0.15, so 15%. So that's quite high. I was auto tuning at 0.1, but even that I think is a bit too high. And the rule of thumb here is, I mean, the higher you set this, the kind of more noise you're allowing, and that's what you need if you've got a noisy build. But if you've got a very clean build, you want the opposite. You want a very crisp response based on a little noise. So what I did was I actually reduced this to 0.075, and did an auto tune, had a look at the p-values in particular. The p-values did come down a little bit, but they were still significantly higher than the p-values I got with the 60/30 tune. And so that I was pretty happy with that, and that's kind of where I left it. So another thing you can do is just back off the PIDs by 25%, say back them all off by 25%, and that's another way of reducing the noise. But I chose to reduce the sensitivity of autotune and retune and get sort of slightly more locked in PIDs, and that's definitely resulted in I haven't got the graph here, but it resulted in a much less noisy tune. Okay, so that's what I've done for essentially for roll and pitch, and you can see that I've got good values, p-values of 18, and then these Excel max values are like 300,000, 300,000. So again, this shows the copter can be very, very responsive. But what I also found was that, and this sort of came out more when I had a couple of friends flying this tune, was that it felt okay, but yaw felt pretty sloppy. And you could see this from the yaw tune. So the Excel max was down at 40,000, I think, even, and the p-value was 11, something like that. So not a great tune. You could see that in sort of the response of yaw. So what I did was then did a yaw tune, and I think what you got to realize is that by default auto-tune does a yaw tune for you, but it's purely based on manipulating P and this E filter value, and I think Leonard calls this something like sort of physical D effectively. So you get this effect where the I think the inertia of the motor bells creates a kind of D, physical D factor for you, and autotune can use that to tune the copter rather than messing with D. So what you find is that autotune will generate values for P, values for filter E, but D is always 0 and I is set to 10% of P. So what you want to do is increase D. So the trouble is that you don't know what the right value for D is. It could be anything. I mean, not anything, but there's a wide range of things that it could be. And so what I did, and this is what Leonard advised me to do, was I started at a very low value and then increased by factors of 10 until I got to an oscillation. And so I think I started at 0.0001, did a hover, looked for oscillation, then did 0.001, did a hover, looked for oscillation, no oscillation, then I did 0.01, did a hover, looked for oscillation, still no oscillation, and then I did 0.1, and at that point there was very obvious oscillation in the copter. I mean, as soon as you powered up, you could see the thing just vibrating as it was trying to take off. So I didn't do that for very long because that's a good way to smoke motors, but basically it told me that this was between 0.1 and 0.01. And then what I did was I reduced, I mean, the wiki gives you guidelines on how to tune D terms, and it's sort of the same. Once you sort of got the same ballpark, you can use those guidelines. And basically what I did was I reduced this D value in steps of 10%, so from 0.1, until I came to a setting. Let me just find it. Probably makes it easier to see. Okay, so this is the wiki, this is the tuning guide, and you can see there's a section on manual tuning of roll and pitch. And so this is what you would do if autotune didn't work for you. And so I followed sort of a modified version of this for tuning yaw. So instead of increasing D in steps of 50%, I increased D in steps of 1,000% essentially. So starting off from a very low value until I got oscillation. Then I reduced D in terms of steps of 10% till the oscillation disappears. And I found that for me, that happened at about 0.4, I think. So D of was 0.03 or 0.04. I think maybe 0.03-ish that the oscillation disappeared. And then reduced D term by a further 25%. So then I backed it off to 0.02. So that was the final value that I came up with. So nothing else has changed. Didn't change P, didn't change I, didn't change filter E, just came up with this value of 0.02 for D. And then flew, and the difference was amazing. So just much more locked in yaw. And my pilot friends who tried it said that it was chalk and cheese, so it felt like a completely different copter. So it just goes to show that actually getting a good yaw tune can make a massive difference to the tune that you get on the copter. So that's the basic tuning process I went through, or sort of the more complicated tuning process I went through. And I'll now describe a few of the tweaks that I made subsequent to that, just to lock it in a bit further. Okay, so I left out something very important in tuning the yaw. And simply tuning D is not sufficient. So D will mean that yaw can go faster, but it won't necessarily go faster unless you change some other parameters. And the other thing to say is that we're adding D, and so D actually needs filtering. So I've got the defaults up here for a similar board with Copter 4.1 on, and you can see that the default for D for yaw is 0, and the default for the D filter is also 0. And then you can see that the default acceleration is 27,000 and the default P is 4.5. And when we add D, we also have to increase this filter rate. And if I switch to my actual copter, oops. So you can see here that I've set D as described, I've got it as 0.02, and I've actually selected a value for the filter of 60 Hertz. Now, tuning this is the same as tuning the filter for roll and pitch. Ideally, you want to try a range of values and see which gives you the best control for the lowest noise. I think a good place to start is just simply setting filter D to the good values that you found for roll and pitch, and I did that. I set it to 75. It then looked like too much noise was coming through, so I set it down to 10, so really quite low, tuned up D on that basis, but then found that the response was not great. And the way I observed that was I simply went straight up full throttle into the air and just let the copter drop. And it was quite obvious with, interestingly, quite obvious with poor yaw control that the thing would just be moving as it came down. But with good yaw control, it would just come straight down. Obviously very dependent on weather and wind and all the rest of it, but that was what I observed. And what I found was that I needed actually quite a high value for the D filter here. And in the end, I plumbed for 60 because that was high enough. So I didn't want to push it too high, but I wanted something that gave me the control that I wanted, and 60 seemed to be it. So that was good from a filtering perspective, but then the next question is this Excel value. And the actual parameter name, if we just switch to full parameter list, is ATC Excel. ATC Excel Ymax. So this is in centi-degrees per second, and you can see I've got it set to 7,200. 72,000. You saw on the other board the default is 27,000, and I think autotune gave me a value of 40,000 originally. Now, if autotunes give me a value of 40,000, that's the rate that it's observed. That's the highest rate of acceleration that it's observed for yaw, and so it sets that value based on what it determines the copter can do, which is fine. But if you then start tuning yaw, this setting will prevent your yaw rate going any higher. So in order to tune yaw, you need to set this to a value where it's unconstrained. And the easiest way to do that is setting it to 0. So basically it means don't apply any damping to the acceleration. Yeah, so to measure this, you have to set this Excel yaw max to 0 and then do a fast yaw. And in 4.2, this is easy because there's a sort of pilot controlled yaw value. In 4.1, it's a little more tricky, I think, because the maximum yaw value only controls acro, so I'm not I'm not 100% sure how you do this in 4.1 other than flying in acro and doing a fast yaw maneuver. So anyway, let's assume that you can do a fast yaw maneuver with this set to 0. Now, you don't want to leave this at 0 because basically this means the acceleration can be unconstrained, but it also means that the control loops have no idea what the maximum acceleration is, and therefore they can ask for acceleration that can't be delivered. And so what this means is that you just can end up with a lot of overshoot. So you push your stick far over, yaw is some way behind, and you get a similar thing when you're slowing down. So time to build up and time to ramp down. But if you set this to 0 and you've done a fast yaw maneuver, then you will end up with a log that looks something like this. And so what you can see I've got is, so this is a log from a fast yaw maneuver. And so you can see I've graphed rate y, which is this yellow one, and then I've graphed PID y, target and actual. Target is red, green is actual, and I've also graphed time in microseconds because this is going to be important in terms of measuring the actual acceleration. So what we're trying to do here is measure the actual acceleration that was achieved. So you can see in my target yaw, I've requested a very, very high yaw rate. So I've pushed my stick hard over, and you can see that the yaw builds up more slowly. But one thing to notice is that you get this double, this sort of double acceleration. So the initial part of the acceleration is very rapid, and then the second part of the acceleration is slower. And the initial acceleration is due to change in the velocity, the angular velocity of the motor bells. So basically, the motor bells can be used to give you a big sudden impulse into yaw, simply based on their mass inertia, whatever, and similarly on slowing down. But that effect will only last for so long because you can basically only do it once. Otherwise the copter starts losing control. And so you can have this big initial impulse, and then the rest of the yaw comes from sort of drag from the propellers. And so this is what we're seeing here. We're seeing initial part of the yaw is generated by acceleration or deceleration of the motor bells, and then the second part is generated by drag on the propellers. It's this motor bell acceleration deceleration which gives rise to this thing that Leonard calls mechanical D. So this is kind of the reason why, or physical D, this is the reason why you can get away with not tuning D at all for yaw, because the interaction of the motor bells with the copter gives you an effective D term that is given physically rather than in software. But we want to go a bit further than that. Okay, so this is the acceleration I've got, and then we can see on the actual yaw rate that I've gone from 0 degrees per second to just about 600 degrees per second. And that's because I've set acro yaw. So on this is on, this is on 4.2, so the parameters are slightly different. So we've got acro yaw, acro y rate, which is in degrees per second, and you see that is 6, so I've set it as a maximum of 600 degrees per second, but which is pretty fast. If I look on vanilla 4.1, it's slightly more convoluted. So let's go back to the other board. Okay, it's a similar board with vanilla 4.1.2 copter loaded on it. And you'll now see that AcroYaw is a p-value of 4.5. So this has been changed in 4.2 because this is just not very understandable. But this is in units of 45 degrees per second. So for instance, if you set AcroYaw p to 10, you would end up with a maximum yaw rate of 450 degrees per second. And so on 4.1, to get a maximum yaw rate of 600 degrees per second, you need to set it to something like 12 or 15, I suppose, something like that. Which is actually higher than this value. So just be aware that in 4.1, this value is slightly different. I've haven't shown you the actual. Let me pop this back on. Mission planner graph. Okay, so here's what I was talking about. So this is the other board. You can see that the parameter is called AcroYaw p, and it's set to 4.5, and so this would be 4.5 times 45 degrees per second for this. If I go back to the copter I'm tuning, this is called AcroYaw rate in degrees per second, which is much more understandable. But so just be aware of that. Okay, so back to the graph. So I've gone from 0 to 600 degrees per second, and it's done that in, so we're trying to read off the time that over the period it's in. I did try setting the graph to time, but I think I didn't have a GPS lock, and so time didn't work very well here. So it's gone from roughly 45.3 seconds here to 46.1 seconds here. So at the point it reaches the maximum rate. So about 0.8 of a second. And we've done 600 degrees, gone from 0 to 600 degrees per second in 0.8 of a second. So applying some simple maths, acceleration is final speed minus initial speed over time. So this would be 600 minus 0 over 0.8, and that gives you a value of 740 degrees per second per second. That can then be translated, so 740 degrees per second. If we go back to Mission Planner here, so you'll see that this Ymax value, this ATCXL Ymax value, this is in centidegrees, so hundredths of a degree per second. So you basically need to multiply that value by 100, and so that's where I get the 72,000 from. So okay, so 740, probably a little bit aggressive, so 720 times 100 gives me 72,000, and so this is now my maximum yaw acceleration that I can then set in this value, and that is it. So a little bit more involved. So you've got to come up with a good value for D. You've got to set the D filter. You've got to measure the maximum acceleration that you can observe using those settings, and then you want to set that maximum acceleration. And the reason you're setting that maximum acceleration is so that the control loops are never demanding of the copter things that it can't manage, and so this is what gives you sort of locked in control. The other thing to just remember here is this is a manual tune, so at this point you're sort of off the reservation for auto tune. Once you've done this, you don't want to go back to auto tune, but this is pretty necessary to get a good yaw tune for the copter.